Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Dan Klein, my colleague here at George Mason University. He is also the editor and founder of Econ Journal Watch, an online academic journal that critiques other economists and other journals. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of today's conversation. Our topic for today is a very broad one, and it is the idea of coordination. An idea in economics that goes back a long, long way and has evolved over time to mean many different things, and I hope we'll talk about some of those different things, different meanings today. Welcome to EconTalk, Dan.
Thank you very much, Russ.
So I want to start with an example that has become somewhat forgotten but brought back to life in different guises by other economists. The example comes from Adam Smith. It's right in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, and he talks about the woolen coat. And he says, the woolen coat, for example, which covers the day laborer, as coarse and rough as it may appear, is the produce of the joint labor of a great multitude of workmen, the shepherd, the sorter of the wool comber or carder, the dyer, the scribbler, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, with many others, must all join their different arts in order to complete even this homely production. How many merchants and carriers besides must have been employed in transporting the materials from some of those workmen to others, who often live in a very distant part of the country? And the most modern example of this phenomenon that Smith talks about that is well known would be iPencil, Leonard Read's little fable about a pencil's production, which he tells in the first person. And he talks about all the different people who contribute to the product of the pencil, and I assume that Leonard Read chose a pencil because it's quite simple, just as Adam Smith chose the homely woolen coat. But they were both talking about a kind of coordination. So tell us, Dan, what kind of coordination they were talking about, and what's its significance?
Yeah, I'd like to think of the whole chain of activities that make the woolen coat or the pencil as a kind of concatenation. Concatenation is a word kind of meaning like a chain, a series of linked and mutually complementary activities. So this vast concatenation, we are in the habit of saying, exhibits a kind of coordination in the sense that, it produces woolen coats, it produces pencils, it produces, all the stuff around us. And we get into conversations about the comparative coordinativeness, if you will, of different regimes in political economy. So I think coordination of these vast concatenations is a way of talking about comparative institutions, about, politics and public policy. The examples you just gave us of concatenate coordination are vast. They are not enclosed in any plan, in actually anyone's view, any real human being's view. Now, simpler concatenate coordinations take place, say, in a firm where the bosses essentially coordinate. They don't coordinate every detail. They delegate a lot of the details, but they coordinate the basic skeleton of activities. So you can have concatenate coordinations that are more or less planned. Actually, there's a coordinator. And you can have vaster concatenations that proceed without any kind of central planning through various spontaneous mechanisms that we talk about.
Well, example I like to use, we're taping this on January 30th, and it will air on Monday, the Monday after the Super Bowl. And I like to use the example of Super Bowl Sunday as an interesting day. It's the is, I think, the number one pizza day of the year. I think more pizza is sold on Super Bowl Sunday than any other day. If it's not, it's in the top 2 or 3. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that sells a lot on Super Bowl Sunday: beer and hot dogs and hot dog buns and the makings for chili and all kinds of things that people use to get through a 4-hour football game and an almost infinite length pregame show.
Yeah.
So the example I like to use is that if you want a croissant on Super Bowl Sunday, you can still get one. You walk up to the baker or the grocery store or the bakery in the grocery store and you say, "I'd like a croissant." They don't say, "What? Don't you realize this is Super Bowl Sunday? All the flour has gone to pizza. And you can't have a croissant. Come back in a few days." That doesn't happen. There's always plenty of beer. And we understand that the coordination that is necessary for all the stuff people want on Super Bowl Sunday to be there is somewhat marvelous, a word that Hayek would use, because there's a lot of people who have to coordinate their actions. But is it really so marvelous? I want to talk initially about whether that is as amazing as I like to think it is. So is that hard? Why is it? It isn't coordinated, certainly by a central coordinator. In a firm, as you point out, there's a lot of raw materials, say, that might go into the production of something, and the head of the firm has to plan to make sure that stuff's around, and because you don't want to, in an assembly process, find you're missing a part or a piece, and then you can't produce the good. So there's a concatenate coordination that all the stuff has to be there, and the parts have to fit together.
Right. In some ways, it's mundane.
So what's the difference between? We don't. That's not marvelous. No, we understand it's important to make sure there's enough stuff around. It's in your house, for example, you need toilet paper and tissues and paper towels and the things that keep your household going. And when they run out, you get frustrated, and you make sure you stock up enough the next time. And what's the difference between that planned coordination that takes place in a household or a firm and the coordination that takes place on Super Bowl Sunday? Why is it marvelous?
When you get out the microscope and look at each link in the chain, it seems pretty mundane. People, pursuing their businesses, pursuing their interests, stocking the supplies, just like you say. It doesn't seem incredible. The term used in the book "Incredible Bread Machine" to talk about some of these things. And yet, the kind of the incredible thing really is the way all the links of the chain work together, come together to produce so much for so much of humanity. And that is going on at a vast scale that I think kind of defies our, if you will, evolved, cognitive nature. Okay, kind of going on this vast, extensive scale, which I don't think human beings are evolved to really easily appreciate or understand. Our intuitions, I think, are more about the concrete, the small group, maybe the hunter-gatherer band, which our genes come from, they say. And so we have a hard time fathoming this vast concatenation of links and the mechanisms that hold it together. It's sometimes called incredible, and I think incredible is a good word for it. And one way I interpret incredible is that anybody's attempt to say they know this vast concatenation or to really know in any detailed way how it works would not be credible. Like we see a super athlete, on the floor of the basketball arena do some incredible things. And we just are really wowed by it. And in a sense, what does it mean to say that was incredible? It means that any description of how it happened is not credible. It's like it can't really be explained. It's like it's beyond our sort of articulate knowledge. And that's an important point, and one of the reasons why it's so important to dwell on the incredibleness. If these concatenations, if society is not really knowable and explainable, it's not likely that it's beneficially manipulatable, right? So I do think there's a very important, incredible aspect to the production of everything that gets produced on Super Bowl Sunday and other days, and we shouldn't take it for granted. And we should dwell on it, and we should think about what it tells us about policy and politics. Now, what it tells us may not be something we can run with in all that rich, research-oriented way, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't remain really important.
Well, let's delve into that. I want to come to the policy and the politics a little bit later. Let's delve a little bit into the claim you made of this web of interactions that produces, say, pizza on Super Bowl Sunday alongside hot dog buns and croissants and other things that use flour, plus as you say, the zillions of other things that are still in the store. It's not like, I mean, it really could be the case. We totally take it for granted, as you point out, but it really could be the case that you could walk into the store on Sunday, on Super Bowl Sunday in the morning, and they'd be sold out because, well, it's Super Bowl Sunday. Everybody, people have a lot of parties. Of course, there's nothing here. Or they could say, well, we have tons of pizza and beer and the things that people use for a party, but of course you can't get chicken soup on Super Bowl Sunday because people don't eat that on Super Bowl Sunday traditionally, and therefore we're out. All the soup aisles would be the shelves would be empty. And that doesn't happen either. We didn't have to mobilize an enormous part of the economy to satisfy the unusual spike in demand on Super Bowl Sunday. But I think it's more than that. And the reason I think it's more than that is that I want to get at the coordination part of this. You talked about it as a chain. In a chain, you miss a link and it falls apart. Obviously, if there weren't trucks and people to drive the trucks to deliver the flour from the mill to the baker, the whole thing falls apart. So, and there's a timeliness, and that's, I think, extremely important. That's often forgotten. It's not just that, well, eventually we get pizza. We get pizza on at 1:30 and at 3 o'clock when we want it. It's not like, eventually the economy produces enough pizza. This stuff is on the shelf waiting for us. So how is that happening? Even though it's incredible, give us some idea of the nature of this concatenation, this linking of actions, and why I want you to justify the claim that it's hard for our minds to wrap them around this concept. Try to elaborate on that.
Well, what's driving the linkings is the pursuit of profit and other normal human interests. And, it's how do two different links hook up, right? And this brings us to the other kind of coordination, what I call mutual coordination, associated with Thomas Schelling and game theory. This notion of coordination is actually the usage that now dominates in economics. The other older concatenate coordination is more or less, I wouldn't say been totally forgotten, but when people talk about coordination nowadays, it's mostly this mutual coordination. And here it's that, the supplier and the baker are coordinating when to schedule deliveries, what terms exactly they're agreeing to,
what shape the bag is,
how big it is, right? All these aspects of their sort of hooking up, and this is a different idea of coordination, but it's going on in myriad forms, both within a single, bakery, plus in the linkages between the different organizations making the spontaneous order. And so again, the incredibleness, I think, is to understand that all of these different all these different instances of mutual coordination are going on, driven by, different human pursuits, to get these links to work together that, in a free system, I feel, produces what, has to be judged as pretty darn good results. I don't know if that really helps to get at the incredibleness of it, but it kind of shows the vastness and the many, many things like the Adam Smith passage. You only read the beginning, but it goes on, and he basically talks about globalization in that woolen coat passage. Just how large and extensive this linkaging goes on. Can I say a little bit about Super Bowl Sunday as another?
Yeah, sure. Because we're going to come back to the incredibleness, but go ahead. Say something about Super Bowl Sunday.
I mentioned mutual
Go
coordination.
Patriots, by the way. I just want to mention that.
You mentioned Super Bowl Sunday, and we've mentioned now this mutual coordination. And actually, Super Bowl Sunday has been studied as an important day of mutual coordination by some economists. I'm thinking in particular of Michael, I don't know how you say his last name, Chwe, Chwe. He has a nice little book on this and a paper about what kind of goods get advertised during the Super Bowl. And he shows that it's disproportionately what he calls social goods, where things like maybe soft drinks, styles, fashions, maybe computer software programs, where he argues that the Super Bowl is a very special opportunity where when people, not only that people watch it, okay, but that people know that other people are watching it, that so many other people are watching it. And so people who advertise, manufacturers who advertise during the Super Bowl sort of know that people are seeing this. Mm-hmm. And that's a kind of mutual coordination, if you will. It's kind of we all kind of have almost a common knowledge that Pepsi or something was advertised during the Super Bowl. And that common knowledge might help provide a kind of focal point to Pepsi being an appropriate or acceptable or maybe a stylish thing to have at your party. Mm-hmm. Not during the Super Bowl party, but just any party.
Right.
And so he shows that because of the kind of mutual coordination aspects of everybody in a kind of common knowledge way looking at the Super Bowl, more social goods are advertised during the Super Bowl.
It's interesting. Let me digress a little farther. I think some people, I'm not one of them, but some people bemoan the proliferation of choice because we lose that shared experience.
Yes.
That some people claim, again, I'm not one of them, but some people claim that it was better when we only had 3 channels and everybody was watching a handful of things on television because then when you came to work the mm-hmm. next morning, we had something to talk about. Well, I'd rather hear about something maybe that I didn't watch, or whole argument ignores the impact of competition on quality, but it clearly is the case that when there is a shared event like that millions of people are watching, and that millions of people know that millions of people are watching, that it does have it has a different flavor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a fan of fragmentation, if you will, of multiple channels and websites and all that. Maybe even in a biased way I am. At the same time, I think that there's a valid, genuine, human value that these people are expressing.
Absolutely, sure.
And it's not something that can be poo-pooed. And you're right, the defenses of it might ignore the benefits associated with fragmentation, with multiplicity. But at the same time, the defenders of fragmentation ought to recognize that something real is being lost. And I think a big part of the political conversation really is about such things. It's about do we want to have the spontaneous order and this kind of fragmented society and really a kind of breakdown of common knowledge, or do we want to somehow capture a sense of cooperation in politics, in the polity, which I think is a big part of really what political parties are doing, at least the ones we observe here.
Well, let me continue the digression and give a different example that I always find unattractive but is compelling to a lot of people, which is public education. Yep. One of the standard justifications for public education is the idea that we should have a shared body of knowledge. Of course, what that shared body of knowledge is up for political grabs once it's in the public education system. It also is not necessarily going to be, as a result of that political political force, it's not going to be the shared body of knowledge that would make the world a better place. Rather, it will be the shared body of knowledge that maybe is most preferred by the people who have the power. And I would argue, again, sort of on the fragmentation side. Fragmentation is an interesting word, Dan. I've never heard that used. It has a certain accuracy, but it has a negative connotation. It sounds like it's broken apart. But I'll stick with it for now because that's interesting. If you have a fragmented school system, you don't fight over prayer in school. People choose if they want prayer in school, they go there. If they want evolution taught, you choose a school with evolution. You want creationism taught, you go to a school with creationism. But the argument for fragmentation is, one, you get this competition, but more than that, you avoid the political dissension that inevitably occurs when you force a single solution onto that. So, on the other hand, as you point out, you do lose whatever would have been shared, which has some advantages. But I would argue that most of the things that were shared by our public education system, say in the last 50 years of its semi-thriving, were not particularly important to the body politic or for creating superb human beings of a thoughtful nature. It was rather less interesting than that. I was taught the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't think my kids know it. I don't really care, to be blunt about it. Yeah. So that shared knowledge has been lost. Other types of shared knowledge are lost as the system fragments politically and practically into more private and homeschool choices, et cetera. I would view that as a plus, but it is interesting to think about what might be lost there. Reaction?
The public school system is probably the leading example of this kind of political effort to give a shared experience, a common school system, right? Common this, common purpose, common cause, and so on. I think it's not, it's about the shared experience and a shared value. It's not necessarily even about making more productive or more intelligent citizens. Now, I have such a strong negative feeling towards this, but empirically, a lot of people simply get joy, identity, comfort, assurance, reassurance out of this. And out of this sense that there is a shared experience, that there is an organization, that society is kind of like an organization that can kind of mutually coordinate their sentiments and understandings towards certain things which our organization does and does together.
Shared purpose.
Right. Shared purpose is crucial to kind of advancing that whole kind of mentality and mythology. And the reality is that, I'm like me, but most people aren't like me, and I can't just say, well, their preferences don't count, or they're invalid. Now, I might argue that they're unenlightened, and to some extent, I certainly would. But you can push that only so far. I mean, maybe once when they were young, they could have been enlightened, but life isn't really reversible. And the fact is that people get all sorts of meaning, comfort, out of some of these political projects, what I call the people's romance, where it's an effort to have a kind of encompassing romance among the people of the polity, that people get a kind of something genuine out of that, and we can't really just throw that out as irrational, throw that out as not counting, throw that out as not. I think I would just say it's potentially dangerous.
Yes, I want to.
Yes,
let's accept the fact that a lot of people feel this way, and they have a perfectly good right to feel this way. But I want to make sure that our listeners understand what exactly you're talking about. So let's hone in on this as we continue to digress. I will come back to, I hope, incredible coordination, but this is so interesting. What do you mean by the people's romance, and what do you mean by this idea of using the polity or the
nation, typically.
The nation as a organization.
Okay, let's go back to the two coordinations, okay? And let me suggest an interpretation of the concept of cooperation.
And that often gets subsumed as an example of coordination. You want to make a distinction. Sometimes.
I do want to make distinctions here. And in fact, I want to use the two coordinations, concatenate and mutual, to define cooperation. Suppose we're thinking about a neighborhood that cooperates in keeping the neighborhood clean. Suppose we're thinking about a bread factory where the workers cooperate in producing bread profitably. The way I want to interpret this is that you've got a group of people. First of all, you've got a kind of referent concatenation. Okay, let's say the bread factory is this concatenation of activities within the factory, linking together within the factory, kind of like the pin factory, to produce bread and to produce it profitably, knowing that profits get shared ultimately with everybody in one way or another. So there's a concatenate a referent, if you will, concatenation, and they're concerned about the good coordination of that. And then among the people in the organization, they are mutually coordinating their awareness, their understanding, and their sentiments about contributing to that.
Yeah, they're aware that they're part of a team.
That's right. Right. It's not enough just that I'm contributing to something. Yeah. If the other guy doesn't know about this concatenation that I see myself as advancing, we're not really cooperating. Like, it's not to me, going back to the woolen coat, if you go one link and then a few links down to someone else who never connect, I wouldn't say that they're cooperating. Okay, they don't have that mutual awareness. They don't have that common knowledge sense of manifest mutual coordination the way people who have a sense of cooperating, say, in a factory do. So
they're on you could say they're on a team, but they're not aware that they're part of a team.
But then, once you start pointing out that they are kind of on a team, you have to point out that they're also got competitors, and I guess that's another team. I mean,
they're on different teams at the same time, so yeah.
I don't like it when Bastiat or Henry George kind of speak as the vast concatenation as an instance of cooperation. It's got myriad instances of cooperation, just that it has instances of competition and many other things. But you can't, and Marx saw this clearly. Marx was actually great on this, and he kind of hated capitalism because it wasn't a vast cooperation, and he wanted the economy to be. He wanted the incredible bread machine. He wanted the great chain to be a cooperation, to be an organization, essentially.
So I just want to point out a language problem here, which I think Hayek writes about a lot, which is we don't have a language or a metaphor for this experience of non-cooperative coordination.
That's right.
That is spontaneous. So let me give the example that you just used. If there were thousands and thousands of people whose actions were coordinated that led to the pizza on Super Bowl Sunday, if you took all those people and put them in the room, they could all say, we made that pizza. But we understand that that's not the same thing as a bunch of people literally in the same room making the pizza as a team, as a group, literally doing the mutual coordination that you're talking about. And Hayek was frustrated by the fact that we don't have a way of thinking about that. And I think that comes back to your earlier point about our brains and our genetic shortcomings in understanding this. We don't have a language. We only have very roundabout and inadequate language to describe what it means we don't have the verb and we don't have the pronouns that describe that.
That's absolutely right. I totally agree. And I totally agree that Hayek was like agonizing over that. You see that, I think, throughout his career. But to go back to this cooperation, so the people's romance is this urge to find this sense of cooperation. Sometimes it's called solidarity, shared experience, all these political terms that we see all the time. And they want a kind of mythology whereby they see the polity as a kind of organization.
That literally cooperates.
Right? I mean, it's very mythological. I mean, it's kind of a very lame and pathetic effort in a sense. But it's a deep undercurrent in politics, and I would say particularly in left-wing politics. But it's not as though it's
in right-wing plenty too.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Supporting our troops and our spreading democracy
look at it. Look at a rally in Germany in 1935. You see plenty of it.
I mean, although Jonah Goldberg will tell you that was left-wing too.
Yeah, it's a stretch for me.
Well, he's got a good point. I mean, it's this left-right thing just breaks down. I think that's maybe the main lesson of that whole investigation. But so the People's Romance is this kind of mythology about the polity or society as organization, so that these sentiments and yearnings for kind of encompassing coordination of sentiment about common purpose, about a common narrative, common experience, and so on. And leaders are playing upon this just constantly, and so are pundits. And and I think people play the People's Romance card even more than they actually believe it.
It earns points with the readers.
Yeah, unfortunately. And I think, I think you're absolutely right, Russ, that People's Romance lovers don't appreciate what all's entailed. They don't appreciate the costs.
And the foregone benefits of the other system, too, I would
Exactly.
argue.
Exactly. And it's kind of an atavism, I would say, to go back to the evolutionary stuff. Hayek talked about social justice as an atavism, and social justice fits right in with this organizational mentality. I'd say that the People's Romance is also a kind of atavism, and it's a kind of penchant that people have to learn to subdue, just like we have a penchant for sweets, which evolution selected for way back when, because the people who, ate up on a lot of sweets had a lot of extra energy on their body, and that helped them survive the winter, or maybe helped them go, tackle outrun the saber-toothed tiger, whatever they were doing. And so evolution selected a penchant for sweets, which does not serve us now, where sweets are abundant, and the hazard is to indulge that penchant too much. Fortunately, in the case of sweets, we have pretty strong individual incentives to learn to subdue this atavistic penchant.
We bear the costs personally.
Exactly. But the thing with the People's Romance is that we don't.
Well, I want you to make the case for that. Not for that part of it, but for why you view the People's Romance as mythological, foolish, dangerous. It's not dangerous. Dangerous will come too, but let's make it clear why you view the. Let me say it differently. One way to talk about the People's Romance that you're describing is people like something bigger than themselves.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a universal human thing. There are many ways to satisfy that urge. Politics is one. The workplace is another. Your religious organization is a third. Your bowling group is a fourth. There's thousands of ways that a civilized society satisfies those ways. But one of those ways is through political movements. And what's wrong with saying, let's act as a group and let's end hunger, put a man on the moon, fight for human justice, all these platitudes that dominate our political discourse. You're suggesting that that's a fool's game. Why?
Well,
isn't that great? I mean, why shouldn't we all band together and let's solve these problems?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have an easy answer to it. All of this effort to create common purpose and shared experience, well, it's not an effective way of actually producing woolen coats and so many things we do in fact really care about. Just in terms of the pursuits and interests frustrated, foregone by doing this are tremendous. And those things are fundamental to us, really, too, and certainly part of our liberal heritage. Liberal in the real sense of the term. And so, what we get, first of all, are I think systems that don't work very well in other terms. They might work well in terms of the People's Romance, comparatively well, but in other terms, they do basically almost terrible. I think basically on just about everything else, and so. That's bad, but at the same time, what's often left out of these discussions is that it's sort of like a cultural disaster. It's like to sustain, first of all, this power structure that's going to lead this experience, create the focal points, create, in a sense, the games we have our lives in, the public school system, the roads, the utility grids, and the superstitions and notions that get promulgated to sustain this whole system are just dreadful. They just fail in all sorts of important, intellectual terms, in terms of quality and integrity. So I mean, in a sense, I want a more liberal society, not so much so, that I can buy woolen coats more cheaply, but so that the culture would be better. It would be less, I don't know what the right word, I don't know, less unsatisfying than it is, and less frustrating. I think people would be lost less.
But is this a question of taste or a question of reality? So let's break it down to a specific example. I'm going to try to give two examples. I'll start with the first, which is Social Security. You hear all the time a strange phrase to me, but it's not strange to other people. It's strange to you as well. In 20 or 30 years, Social Security might have some financial problems, and, quote, we won't be able to take care of the elderly. And I hear a phrase like that, and I think, what are you talking about? We're the wealthiest society on earth. Who's the we? Our elderly? What is that? What do those words mean? Now, they do strike a deep chord, obviously, what you're referring to, but is it only the point then that it's an illusion? Because if it's only an illusion and people are laboring under a misunderstanding that there is a we that's real, because in their mind it is real. When we act via Social Security, we are taking care of the elderly. Are they wrong?
Right. They go through life, they feel good about that, they die, and, in some sense it comforted them that what you're calling an illusion. And it's not clear why you want to take that, I mean, I might want to take it away from them because, in the sense that there's larger social costs, but you can't say that doesn't count for that person. But I think you're right. The Social Security is another leading example of this people's romance enterprise. It's us taking care of us, right? It's the social safety net. I mean, think about a safety net. It encompasses all the polity, everybody, in all their activities. If you go really wrong, you're going to fall on the social safety net. I mean, it's really very, very got this flavor of encompassing, experience and sentiment. But you're right. I mean, the discussion of such matters is degraded, I would say, because it depends. I mean, this whole project, this whole penchant, satisfying or seeming to satisfy this whole penchant depends on these kind of degrading ways of speaking and so on.
Well, I would argue that it's more than just an illusion, and it's more than just intellectually dishonest. And I want to come back to a fundamental concept, which is it's in Adam Smith when he talks about I think it's the theory of moral sentiments. You'll tell me when he talks about the earthquake in China and how you can get more upset about a hangnail than you do about thousands of people dying thousands of miles away.
It was a whole pinky.
Okay, so we like the idea. I think most of us like the idea that we would be deeply affected by an earthquake in China. But the fact is that most people are not. The reality is there is not enough love to go around so that we can love each other. That whole, I want to come back to our concatenate coordination idea. If the world really did rely on all of us caring about each other, the world would be in a bad situation. The power and the humanity of the uncoordinated, spontaneous order, as opposed to the designed, led political order, as an example of that, is that you don't have to rely on love, which is not a bad thing. Most people say, well, it'd be better if we relied on love. The answer is that it would not work very well.
Right.
And there are bad people in the world who will use that romance to do something other than take care of the elderly.
Yes.
And I think that is the great danger. The danger of tyranny. It's not just that, as you say, the coats will be more expensive. I can live with that, and we do that in our households all the time. We do all kinds of, quote, inefficient things, communal living of various kinds, the kibbutz and others. Those have had success at various times because people are willing to sacrifice what we talked about for some success for material success for a shared purpose. The problem is that when you go to the larger body politic, you don't just get a little more of everything and a little less of other things. You get tyranny. You get the risk of real evil rearing its face.
That you do get that risk, but even if you don't get to, I don't know what we're going to call tyranny. Are we living under tyranny?
No, we're not. Well, this is not tyranny.
It's not tyranny, but if you ask some of the people who are in cages on drug violations, they might tell you otherwise. But that's another example, right, of a pursuit, a collective pursuit. But definitely, it's dangerous, and I think it's degrading. Adam Smith, Adam Smith's first book kind of posited that we have a strong kind of love penchant. We have a strong penchant for coordinated sentiment, for sympathy, he called it. Some people today might suggest that it be called empathy. But I see it as basically mutually coordinated sentiment that he was talking about in the moral sentiments, and we have a very strong natural impulse towards that. Again, I think that makes sense in light of the evolutionary argument, the Hayekian evolutionary argument, which sees us as altruistic and solidaric in the hunter-gatherer band, not brutish and individualist. Anyway. And I see the Wealth of Nations as Smith saying, we have this concern about the impartial spectator and doing good, and some of us realize that it should extend to humanity. But guess what, folks? When we think hard about how these concatenations work, it works out okay just to kind of focus on the local. And so I see Smith as like authorizing this narrower self-interest to be cut loose. So in a sense, he's really starting with the solidaric impulse and then saying, folks, we should now authorize the self-interest because it works better to make the woolen coat.
But you're making a deeper claim, which, by the way, we're going to revisit, I'm sure, in a couple of weeks. I'll be talking to Deirdre McCluskey about the bourgeois virtues, which this is obviously going to touch on. But the deeper claim, I think, is that cultural claim. And by culture, you mean the fabric of day-to-day life, I assume, and what we feel and see. And it's really better to take care of your grandmother than for your grandmother to get a check in the mail and hope things work out sometimes. Sometimes you want real cooperation rather than this joint people's romance cooperation.
That's right. There's that too. I mean, the People's Romance version does crowd out what would be all sorts of more meaningful, local, genuine forms of cooperation. What I call club romance. I contrast club romance, kind of like Buchanan's Club Goods, a kind of voluntary club coordination of sentiments, which Smith was very optimistic about. I take in particular his discussion of religion, where he says, free religion without a state church and without any restrictions on competition are going to produce candor and moderation, he said. And he basically had a vision of, churches competing and people coming to have these kind of club romances in their churches. I think
he was onto something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure our colleague Larry Iannacone will support us on that. There's a very real sense in which the People's Romance destroys real cooperation, crowds it out, destroys it, subverts it. It's jealous of it. It actually sometimes works against it, I would say almost deliberately. Homeschooling, private schooling, basic hostility towards private power, private places, shopping malls, private concentrations of wealth. I mean, I see a lot of the antagonism towards Walmart and things like that as a kind of jealousy, a kind of hostility towards something else that could be a focal source of common experience for people, something other than the government, the people.
Well, one of my favorite examples of this, which I've always enjoyed, but your discussion helps me see it in a different light, a fuller light. I saw this in a book review in the New York Times. I don't remember the book, I don't remember the reviewer, but it described the following incident. Peter Lynch was the fund manager was the fund manager for the Magellan Mutual Fund for a long time and had incredible success. We could debate whether he was lucky or skilled, but it doesn't matter. People think he's skilled. Not sure, but that's the way people think. The story is that Peter Lynch was walking in a shopping mall, and someone recognized him and ran up to him, pumped his hand, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Lynch. I was able to build an addition onto my house because of the Magellan Mutual Fund's returns." And the book reviewer told the story in horror because he said, we should be feeling that about labor unions and about political parties, not about a mutual fund manager. And of course, as an economist with a spontaneous order bent, I'm looking at that and thinking, that's what's great about Peter Lynch. But people do feel that way. It's a very strong urge. And they do see Peter Lynch, as you point out, as a competitor to their power and their influence and their source of shared experience.
Yeah. And you have that story about, I forget, a medical researcher or a medical guy, and someone wrote to him. He felt he didn't achieve anything in life, and then someone wrote to him a letter or something about how he, in fact, saved someone in his family. But it's so distant. It's not actually a shared experience.
Right.
But I guess, you could say that it kind of became one in this very individual way when they did come to communicate somehow. And that's what's going on in the vast concatenation in just myriad ways. And we have to learn to appreciate that. I mean, that's what being liberal is really all about.
In the classical sense of the word.
Yeah, which is the genuine sense of the word. I mean, the American liberal terminology is just a fraud, and so on. I'm not sure if you want to go somewhere else in particular, but
go where you want.
Yeah, what's an interesting part of all this is, okay, so what do we? I mean, when we talk about a factory and we think about the owners wanting basically profits, of course, constrained in all sorts of normal, humane ways. We're not talking about rent seeking for profit. We're not talking about ripping people off for profit. And if they did that, in a sense, we would frown on it as coordination, even if their profits were greater.
Right.
But when we talk about a factory, we kind of have a pretty good sense of, there being people, chiefs, who have a sense of it being better coordination, and we enter into their sense of that, and we kind of know what we're talking about. But when we talk about the incredible bread machine or the vast skein of whatever term you want to use for the whole big grand concatenation, what all do we mean? Right? And in what way is aggregation going on? And so on. And I want to suggest that what we do, if only implicitly, is imagine a mind able to behold it, even though we cannot. And we're having a kind of conversation about what that mind is like, what that mind would find more satisfying or pleasing. And so when we talk about coordination, we're actually like developing our understanding, not only of what produces washing machines better, but what is more beautiful or we should count as more beautiful to this mind. And sometimes we're trying to characterize the sensibilities of this mind. And naturally, this is very much a negotiation and a groping, and it's always going to be incomplete. And people have different ideas of what it is or what it should be. And that's kind of what, to a great extent, what the conversation is about. Like, what is the maximand? Not like what maximizes the maximand. So that's the difference between efficiency, optimality, social welfare function, all this stuff that's taken over modern economics, and coordination.
Because coordination doesn't require a maximand. There's no pretense. There isn't a maximand, clearly.
There's no pretense of
maximized.
A well-defined maximand, whereas the others do have the pretense of a well-defined maximand. And I think that's all part of a kind of urge towards scientific status and positivism and so on. And the unfortunate thing, and this is one reason that concatenate coordination fell off the map. It's not only that mutual coordination, which I love, rose and kind of took the day. It's also that efficiency, optimality, social welfare function rose in place, the scientific version, in place of this concatenate coordination, which was prevalent. Aaron Osborne and I have done systematic JSTOR research to show that it used to be concatenate coordination that economists meant, but then after Thomas Schelling and game theory, it's mutual coordination. So why did concatenate coordination disappear? Partly because economists kind of glommed onto mutual instead, but partly it's because optimality and so on, efficiency, pushed coordination off the table.
Because it couldn't talk to it.
That's right. They couldn't talk to it and remain value-free and clearly economic science and so on.
So I'm totally mystified by this thread of the conversation, Dan. So let me come back to what you were saying when you're talking about a mind and trying to talk about a sensibility and what's better. And when you say what mind could comprehend it, obviously if you're a religious person, you can talk about the mind of God. I don't think that's what you meant. I assume what you meant was...
That's an interpretation.
But when we look at the world around us, and we see the extraordinary set of choices available to an American consumer. And it's not just that there's a lot of choice. It's not that the things just get cheaper and cheaper and more affordable. It's that they're always available. It's not just that you could have 50 different TVs. You can have it tomorrow. You could have it this afternoon. You can have it in probably about 45 minutes if you have a big enough car to take the TV home in. It's just out there waiting for us. And I think, one point I don't think we talked enough about is that the miracle, the incredibleness of it is that it's not just TVs. I mean, TVs alone would be an extraordinary thing. Designing a production system that coordinated all the different people who had to make a TV would be amazing. But you also get peaches, and you get shirts, and you get haircuts, and you get software design, and you get the thousands and thousands of things.
But we don't get common experience.
But we don't get as much common experience. Or I would say it differently. I would say we get our common experience in those islands of organization. We get it within our economics department. Say we get it within the factory that you do work in. But the real question is this. I want to get to this idea of maximan, that there's nothing being maximized. This idea that how can we look at this vastness and say it's good or it's not good or it's working well or it's not working well. The way that we economists of this tradition tend to do it is we say, look what's all the stuff that's on the shelves. Look how it gets better over time. Look how more and more people can afford these things. And by things, we don't just mean the woolen coat and the pizza. Of course, we mean better health care and a better quality of life and everything that goes with that. Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by the fact that it can't be judged by the normal standards that economists use today? Or what do you mean by the idea of a sensibility about it?
Okay. Adam Smith in the Moral Sentiments makes a distinction between two types of rules, which I think is very useful here. One type is he calls definite and exact, and he gives the example of grammar, where there's kind of pretty clear rules about what you need to do to satisfy grammar, to conform to grammar. And criticism of your performance basically really only takes a negative form in the sense that, you fault people for violating grammar, but you don't actually, congratulate someone just because they've achieved grammar, right? In fact, you could turn in a blank piece of paper as a homework assignment and it'll get an F, but it can't really be faulted in terms of grammar, right?
Right.
And so he's got kind of the grammar rules, and he contrasts that with the rules for sublime and elegant writing, okay? A kind of what Lon Fuller calls aspirational rules. Okay, so more of an aesthetic. Mm-hmm. Now, this he calls loose, vague, Smith calls loose, vague, and indeterminate. And what I'm suggesting is that much more of our conversation is in this kind of almost aesthetic realm of the loose, vague, and indeterminate than most economists are comfortable admitting because of all their science pretensions and anxieties, and now kind of norms and kind of the way they're trained into it and everything. And so I mean, we have sensibilities about what's better and worse in music, in movies. I mean, when we go to a movie, we have fruitful conversations about why it's good or bad. Critics, and here criticism can be positive or negative. You can really praise somebody for doing things well. But it's not, and it's not arbitrary. I mean, some movies are just bad, and like everyone's going to say it. They're not going to go anywhere. No one's really going to be forgotten quickly. I mean, they're just bad. And even if their grammar is right, in a sense, they're just not good aesthetically. Of course, there's differences between us, and we're going to like different things, but we can argue towards some convergence, and I think we do whenever we really seriously pursue something in beauty or art or whatever, culture, and we talk to others who have likewise pursued and studied it and thought about it and talked about it. So it's not arbitrary, and it's not this exact and definite either. It's in this realm of the loose, vague, and indeterminate, and I think the coordination fits into that. I don't necessarily want to suggest it as kind of the all-encompassing term for goodness, whatever it is, but maybe it's an aspect of the all-encompassing goodness, which is a deep kind of never resolved, never fully characterized thing.
But isn't the argument of the critics of the Concatenate order that you and I romanticize, perhaps? Isn't there criticism that it is unaesthetic, that getting and spending we lay waste our powers, as Wordsworth said, as Dickens talked about so many of his characters having venal, narrow lives focused on the bottom line.
Yeah, well, some of those criticisms might be sound in particulars.
But is there a trade-off then between concatenate order and shared purpose that would argue for more communal activity that's coercive? Or let me say it differently.
I mean, I don't come down with my conclusions quite that way. Not that I'm necessarily 100% opposed, but certainly some people argue that way. I mean, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm yet to be enlightened. But yeah.
Well, what's your argument to that? What's your counterpoint when someone says that all you get from concatenate order is a bunch of woolen coats and more colas and pizzas and flat screen TVs, and that's degrading? Where's the aesthetics? Where's the aesthetic beauty in that?
Well, again, I think that once you are able to give up this penchant for an encompassing, official experience, and you somehow subdue that and come to a kind of contentment with a more limited form of shared sentiment, cooperation, love, and beauty shared with others, who are also appreciating it, friends and critics and other writers or whatever, that you have all sorts of spiritual, of course, all sorts of spiritual opportunity and depth. I mean, really, I think these people who insist on this kind of encompassing, people's romance idea of shared experience and so on, I think there's a kind of greediness actually to them. I think this is a cultural greediness where they want it their way, and they're very prepared to use force against people who don't particularly want that and who go against it. I don't know, just the way I see things stacking up, there's way too much of that.
But what's the justification then for the concatenate order if it's not the traditional modern, to use an oxymoron? The traditional modern mainstream economics argument is that it's efficient, and you're rejecting that. Why?
I'm more saying this efficiency is not actually that nearly as well defined as they make out. I mean, if you want to do, willingness to pay, consumer surplus plus producer surplus, there's all sorts of, contextual things about what that means in a given case. Given what options, given what knowledge of people's willingness to pay, over what time span of planning, given how much reflection by the people, and plus just the fact that we don't actually, have great measures out there of everybody's willingness to pay for different things. What's people's willingness to pay for the people's romance or what have you? So I mean, on efficiency, if you think of it in this abstract kind of supply and demand framework of consumers and producer surplus, I just think it's not nearly as really well defined or exact or definite as they make out. And there's all sorts of issues involved, and all sorts of people studying behavioral economics will tell you about all the inconsistencies and ambiguities and personal choice, people doing things they regret, and weakness of will, and
imperfect information.
Yeah, and so on, right?
So it's not efficient, and we say so what?
but it's not like I want to throw economics out by any means. I mean, I think I teach supply and demand, and I teach consumer and producer surplus. And all that is partly conveying what I think is this larger, richer notion of some kind of goodness. It's it's bringing out aspects of it that really do matter and really should be understood. It's not nailing it down into a grammar as much as we sometimes or people sometimes seem to suggest. But it's real. I mean, and it brings out all sorts of points about the costs of interventions, which are part of, the judgment between A and B ultimately. Should we have a minimum wage or shouldn't we? And those models and those ways of speaking certainly help us see some of the costs and benefits on each side. Does that?
Yeah, no, it's just an interesting thing. The way I think about it sometimes, I think, as we've talked about here before, a lot of what we do in our classes, unfortunately, I think, is dumbed down graduate economics rather than what a civilized person should understand about the world. And to me, what we're talking about today in our halting imperfect way, is what economics has to contribute to an understanding of the world. What I think of as what I want my children to understand in as they grow up about the world, whether they become economists or study economics or not. I think every thoughtful person should appreciate the concatenate order, what is marvelous about it. And I hope we've started to convey the beginnings of that. It's a very, very, very interesting subject. Before we stop, I want to ask you, we'll totally shift gears here, unless you want to add anything else about concatenate order.
Fine.
And
I'm good.
You're okay. I do want to say that I think it's important to emphasize that when we talk about the beauty of concatenate order, that we do not rule out these shared experiences. We're not talking against them, either their importance or their beauty or their value. I think about it a lot when I think about you, the listener, listening to this. You're sitting on the metro, or you're in your car, or you're on an exercise machine, you have earplugs on, and you're by yourself listening to these words today, but you're listening with thousands of other people.
That's right.
You don't know who they are. You don't literally have that shared experience, and we try to create some of that through the comment section, and I'm thinking about other ways to do that. But I think these enterprises that are fragmented are the way to a meaningful, real shared experience, I hope. But to shift gears, Dan, a while back you started an enterprise called the Econ Journal Watch, and I want you to just tell us a little bit about that, because it's such an unusual academic project. So what is Econ Journal Watch?
Okay, it's an online journal. It comes out 3 times a year. It's a scholarly academic journal, I'm happy to say, in any sense of the term. It's got an advisory council of impressive economists, including 6 Nobel laureates. It's indexed by EconLit and the Social Science Citation Index. It's peer-reviewed, and so on. Well, I mean, it's a very serious enterprise. I'm the chief editor. I've got Bruce Benson, Fred Foldvery, Larry White, George Selgin as co-editors, Kevin Rollins, managing editor, and some other people helping out on a regular basis. And what the journal does is, I guess you could say 2 things. It launches criticisms of academic economics. First of all, just on an intellectual level of criticizing articles in prominent journals, pointing out omissions, irrelevance, steps in lines of reasoning that don't follow. And so it directly criticizes and comments in ways that the major journals no longer do. They've more or less most of them have more or less cut the comment sections out of their journals. And of course, we always invite the commented on author to reply. Very often they do. So very often we have these back and forth exchanges, and often with, influential people in the profession. Exercising a kind of accountability on what's going on in the journals, often just replicability, issues of replicability of studies and stuff. We've had some criticisms along those lines. And we do other investigations of various sorts about the character of economics, about the institutions of academic economics, about whether economists working in specific areas reach policy conclusions. And very often they do, more than the people realize, and more than journals like the Journal of Economic Literature and the Journal of Economic Perspectives tell us. I think those journals fail terribly in that respect. So there's criticism. There's kind of like we're not going to play along in the genteel society of getting along and sort of sucking up to the people at the top of the pyramid of academic economics. Maybe it's partly because some of us don't have that much to lose, and we just kind of took this alternate track, this challenger track. So there's all that side. Also, I have to say all this comes from, not that I have to say, but I should say that it does come from a kind of liberal Smith-Hayek perspective. And so this is also, to me, a way of that kind of economist kind of bringing themselves to the table. They haven't really given us, as it were, a place at the table, at the elite tables of the profession.
Or we haven't earned it. So.
Yeah.
We're not at the table as much as we used to
maybe
be.
They haven't, maybe they haven't excluded us, but we're talking in this very, but there's a kind of groupthink theory behind this, which means it's not a conspiracy, but there's a kind of problem. And I see Econ Journal Watch as one way, not the only way, other things that George Mason economists and many others are doing, of kind of asserting ourselves in a way that gets us a place at the table, I hope, at least kind of in my mind. And we are, like I say, engaging people. We're engaging the top journals in terms of criticism, and we're very widely read. I mean, we email many economists. They get the announcement. I'm sure many graduate students are interested to see influentials criticized and these exchanges happening. I'm hoping that the younger generation, has more of an appreciation for these kinds of conversational techniques, discourse techniques, as well as the point of view that the people writing in the journal, I think, mostly represent.
Well, I think it's a wonderful phenomenon, and congratulations on your entrepreneurship in starting it. It's unusual. My guest today has been Dan Klein, professor of economics at George Mason University. Dan, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you very much, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.